Now recording. Hope you're feeling better when you see this. Good morning, everybody. In very important news, I found I had to go back to having a green marker again, even though they're just not visible on the board, because otherwise my staff of markers is not complete. So, in more interesting news, next week we are scheduled to have a test. So, if you take a look at the modules, you will see this week, which is week 9, we will be covering the model view controller architecture. This week we will focus on some of the more high-level concerns around web application design. How things kind of look top-down. In terms of code constructs, the only really new thing we have to learn in that respect is how PHP imports other pieces of PHP. It's not that difficult to grasp relative to other things, so I think that this won't be too bad a leap for you. But if you take a look at next week, we have form validation / midterm. So the midterm exam, which is occurring next week, will take the form of a Canvas quiz. There is a good infrastructure for this already in place, left there by Dr. Brown, so I think in this case I'm choosing to add to and revise the existing framework rather than throw the whole thing out and do a paper test the way that I did with fundamentals, because the tests for fundamentals were basically just lab exercises that you were expected to do in much less time. So, it's going to be a quiz through the Canvas quiz system. Let's see here, assignments. It'll be under the assignments tab. There is a practice midterm that has been published. So, if you'd like to, practice it, here you go, right? And I don't mind sharing with you the instructions for the midterm. So, the test will be 120 minutes in duration, but it has been written such that it can be completed in 60 minutes. So this is, again, that UDL stuff, Universal Design for Learning. The idea is that, this in theory accounts for people's accommodations, extended testing accommodations, or should. And it basically extends extended test writing accommodations to everyone in the class type idea. But anyway, so it's 120 minutes in duration. The test is open book in that you can access any resources, for example, course notes or websites like W3 Schools, but communication with other people during the test is strictly prohibited. So we will write the test in this room under formal test writing conditions. You are not to communicate with other students, but otherwise you can use reference material on the internet to assist you in the completion of your test. Probably W3 Schools will be your most useful reference in this respect. Question?
Dr. Moore?
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, does that mean the test will be centered around application type questions rather than theoreticals?
It's a mix of both.
Okay.
But like, at a certain point, it's like, you know, write CSS code to do X when you have W3 schools available. To me, that's kind of a knowledge question, you know?
Is it though, wouldn't that just be a copy and pasting from the learning center?
I mean,
Maybe.
again, you know, if you want a flavor for it, the practice midterm is out there. I'm not going to be departing. Like, I will be, you know, mixing up the questions on this. So, you know, probably I'll angle things towards the sorts of things we discussed in class this semester. You know, take anything out that we didn't discuss, that sort of thing.
Perfect.
But, yeah, no, it's, basically, the problem that this is seeking to address is that it's not reasonable to expect people to memorize things like CSS attribute names. Anybody in real life will be able to look that stuff up, right? And because we're like, you know, much of this course focuses on sort of big picture things rather than the minutia, right? That we never really got the practice to the point where memorization of that type would be something you would accomplish in this course anyways, right? It's more important that you know where to look things up, right? But yeah. Any other questions about that?
Yeah.
For example, all the work you submit must be your own. Example, you can look up how a CSS style works on W3 schools, but you cannot copy and paste the entire answer from a website. So there you go. So reference material only. Please don't like just look up the answer and paste it in. All right. This does not mean like just throw the question itself into Google, right? Because, you know, I will be invigilating the test and I will be watching to make sure you're not, you know, stepping over the line, as it were. Make sense? Any questions?
Dr. Murray, can I take the exam in my laptop?
Yes, it's a Canvas quiz, so that would be fine, yeah. I would consider open book also to include like VS Code. If you want to like plunk out a little bit of code and see what VS Code like the compiler does with it, that I would consider that also to be inside of the scope of open book, if that makes sense. Good. Oh, yes.
My old materials in a tablet. Can I see them on tablet? Or do I need to copy all of them?
Course notes
Yes.
are good. Yeah, if your course notes are on a separate device, I think that's reasonable. That you should have a second device there and not have to just arbitrarily copy all of your notes over to your other device for no reason other than I only want one device. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah, good. So, we won't go through the practice midterm in class. I'll leave that for your own personal self-study. But, there you go. So, let us jump into our topic for today, which is the Model View Controller, or MVC architecture. So, have I talked about MVC architecture at all with you guys until now? No? Okay, so we're going into this quite fresh. That's good. So, a thing you may have noticed, with all of the interlocking pieces of technology that we have been studying in this class so far, it's starting to get a little bit complicated, no? You know, on the client side, we've got HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just for starters. The document object model is another thing that you have to learn, which, you know, in theory, it's a layer underlying all of the bits that we've created so far, right? All of that produces the client view. Through HTTP protocol, that connects to the server. The server, so far, we've really only talked about how to write some simple PHP scripts, but I assure you that there's a lot going on behind the scenes on a server that you can get into if you're sufficiently deep into this stuff, right? We've kind of been dealing with more surface level things, but even PHP is sufficiently complicated for its own course, right? And then, communicating through SQL, we have databases and other sort of data repositories that can be interacted with. I would even throw things like Git repositories on this end these days. Things get complicated. One of the things that inhibits the ability of programmers to write programs is the complexity of the software itself, right? This is a well-known result within computer science. Basically, whenever we have a programming language, how far we can take it is fundamentally limited by our mechanisms of abstraction, right? If we cast our minds back into the history of computing, in the very, very early days, computing occurred on punch cards. Some of us may be old enough to remember punch cards. Joke, nobody's old enough to remember punch cards. But, well, except for very, very old people. But when you were programming on a punch card, there was basically no abstraction available whatsoever. You took a hole punch and you punched out physical holes in a physical card, and those were instructions. You were punching out bytes to be fed into a computer. No abstraction whatsoever. At some point, someone got the clever idea of hooking up a keyboard, a monitor, and a file system to the computer itself. This allowed the development of assembly languages and compilers. So, rather than physically punching out instructions, we now had the abstraction of language, right? We could now write a document in a computer using characters, like characters are the abstraction, and this made programming much, much easier. We were able to write much more complicated programs because assembly code helped us along that path. The next step up from that were compiled programming languages. There were many examples of these. Early examples include things like Fortran, BCPL, and Lisp, Pascal, sort of the languages of the 60s and 70s. These were languages which compiled to assembly. They provided a further layer of abstraction, and thus the amount of programming that a person could usefully do was again expanded. Eventually, the programming language C comes along. Its fundamental abstraction is you can write one program and compile it on any computer. Before then, you had to write a program for one specific computer. This, of course, another abstraction mechanism this was actually one of the more important ones. It caused an absolute explosion in the amount of software that could be usefully written and shared around. It basically enabled software to be shared, right? That's why C remains to this day the basis for all of the rest of the programming language, most of the rest of the programming languages that exist, because it just exploded in popularity in the 70s. Subsequent to that, we have the development of object-oriented languages. It's all well and good. C had a number of useful abstractions, including functions. The ability to package up functions with the data that they operate on in the form of an object allowed us to write even larger programs and manage even more complexity, right? But basically, all of these innovations have, well, most of these innovations have one common thread that connects all of them. We get closer and closer to an implementation of replaceable parts in the context of software, right? I don't know how much you know about the Industrial Revolution, but back in the 1800s, there was a time when we were making things like steam engines, but before we had developed the concept of replaceable parts. So every screw and every bolt were hand threaded, and every bolt matched only one screw, right? If you go to the Steam Museum in Hamilton, here down by the waterfront, that beautiful machine is of that type. Every single nut on a boiler down there only fits one thread, right? It's fine, but it means basically everything has to be manufactured in the place where it's installed, right? If you're able to have all of the bolts use only one model of a nut, you can manufacture that in one place and then ship that nut everywhere else, right? Which is, it's the model of manufacturing which has made the modern world possible, right? Software is one of the most complicated things that human beings produce in terms of sheer complexity, right? This is the intellectual journey that we need to make in order to understand why something like MVC architecture is good and useful, and we should learn how it works so that we can make other things work like it, right? So, in software, the longer that you're in this field, the more of this you're going to run into. Design patterns. A design pattern is a well-defined solution that we can apply to known problems. So, the general idea is you are confronted with problem X. Solution Y has already been worked out. Your role as the programmer is not universally to invent from scratch the solution to every problem that you encounter. If you were a civil engineer, you wouldn't, you wouldn't reinvent trusses for every bridge that you build, right? Typically, we split a problem up into logical subcomponents and define how those subcomponents interact together. This is the act of decomposing a problem. Decomposing a problem is a very, very important skill in many areas and aspects of, science in general, engineering in general, but particularly so in computer science. Again, due to the inherent complexity of the thing that you are trying to accomplish, if you try to deal with the operation whole cloth, software becomes very difficult to manage. You have a much higher risk of introducing bugs, and just as a general, it just makes the software not work very well if you haven't modularized it. And the level of modularity should always be smaller than you think it should be, right? It should always make sense, but people tend to make their modules too big, right? Smaller is always better. What this allows us to do, when a module solves one problem, and only one problem, and that's a strictly and rigidly defined problem, we have reasonable assurances of the correctness of our solution, right? If I'm writing a function in PHP to read a file and convert it to a JSON, something like that, some operation, you can tell when that works, right? You can test it. So, Model View Controller introduces another layer on top of that. We are collecting sequences and collections of like operations that operate to the same goal, and we are saying this is one region of the software, right? There are several benefits to design patterns aside from what I mentioned. If you've modularized software, that allows different people to work on different subcomponents of the same piece of software at the same time. So, one of the big problems we have with large pieces of software is that, it's all well and good if your software is no larger than a one-person project, right? The one-person project is still a, let's just say that one-person project software products still compete well in the marketplace. I'm thinking particularly of video games when I say this, because, there you end up, every once in a while you end up with people who are kind of these polymaths who can do the art, the music, and the programming, right? When that's possible, it provides the piece of software with a kind of unified vision, which sells well in general in the marketplace, right? The sort of antithesis to that in that particular market is you have these very large budget AAA games that are made by the major publishers, which often have thousands of people working on them. It's kind of also like the same comparison of the Hollywood movie versus like the independent film, right? Except independent films don't do nearly as well as independent video games, just because of the nature of showing them, But at any rate, it is, if you're going to work with, perhaps hundreds of other developers, if you have not modularized the software, people will constantly be in each other's business and changing things that they ought not to change. It's like, why did you change that? I set that way last week, It's like, oh, well, I needed it to do this. And it's like, it's a recipe for disaster, right? But if everybody has a set of files that they work on that are their responsibility, and their responsibility alone, right? Or perhaps, one or two people work on a set of files, it makes the group sizes smaller, more manageable. It prevents people from interfering with each other in that way. You can also get a fair ways by correct and intelligent use of repositories, software repositories. I've mentioned these before, I'm sure. Question?
Yes. If you modularize, you're eliminating the problems that you mentioned. However, when you have all the modules completed, who puts the modules together and then assumes they're all going to work together? That seems like a big step.
It is a big step, right? This is also part of the problem solved by MVC, though, right? MVC is instructions on how to put the modules together, right? But you're absolutely right. So in more formal software circles, you have testers, people who test software for a living, right? It's actually it's a well-known phenomenon in software development circles that, like, the road to senior developer positions passes through the testing department, right? So when you test a single module, you are performing what's called unit testing, right? Unit testing is good. Because unit testing is an effective way to test modules, we can be reasonably sure that the modules themselves solve the problem they claim to solve, right? The functions work, right? The next step up from that is a type of testing we call integration testing. So the level of abstraction on top, right? The thing that's using all of these modules, you're absolutely right, that must be tested to be correct, right? However, it goes into its testing knowing that the problem isn't any of the functions it's calling. It might be the way it's calling them, but that's, again, a problem for the thing calling the functions, not the function itself, right? So, yes, there are, at some point, someone writes a main function, right? Somewhere, eventually, something has to be presented to the user, right? But, you can decrease the difficulty of the integration by sticking to the design patterns that make good modules. Does that make sense? Is this making sense? Yeah? Good. So, let's talk about the model view controller architecture. So, architecture is a word that has a few different meanings in computer science depending on what you're talking about, right? So, when you're talking about computer architecture, you're actually talking more about hardware details, right? Like, how has the CPU been arranged, that sort of thing. You then also have operating system architecture, which is getting closer to what this idea is. It's, how is the operating system structured? Am I working with a command line interface or a GUI, or am I working with a command line interface pretending it's a GUI? All of these types of things, right? Not to bring up bash programming. yet another consecutive class. But in Bash, you have the standard buffers, right? You have standard input, standard output, standard error. Programs are written to interact with those three buffers, right? That is an element of operating system architecture. That's how the operating system works, right? The system call stack is operating system architecture. I told you about the call stack, right, at some point, right? Pretty sure. So that's like architectural detail at the level of the operating system. But architecture in this sense is the architecture of an individual application, and what it broadly refers to is the manner in which modules have been composed into slightly larger modules, or, basically, if you can write your program as a diagram or a flowchart, where that diagram or flowchart is representing broad functions, you're talking about an architecture, right? So, Model View Controller particularly splits our application into three main sections. You may have guessed them already. This is widely used in web applications, but it's also used for other applications like mobile and desktop applications. So, what are the components? Number one, we have the view. The view is the part that the end user will see. The view as a component of the architecture is that which generates what the user sees. Right? So there is a segment of the code which dictates, for our purposes, what the HTML looks like. Right? When we work on an HTML file, we are working on a view. All right? Number two, we have the model. The model is comprised of the essential logic of the operation. This includes retrieval and storage of data. So retrieval and storage of data through databases, through the file system as well. Right? So when we write like a CSV file, that is a model operation. The model also contains the structure of the data that you're operating on. We also work with a slightly simplified version of this in the Java class that I'm teaching concurrently with this class. In Java, we distinguish only between the model and the view. So in Java, which is sort of a strongly object-oriented class and language, we will do something like, say, let's write an application which simulates a vending machine, right? The class representing the vending machine itself is the model. So it will have methods like insert coin, return change, vend an item. The class representing the view will contain the user interface which uses that vending machine, right? So all of the parts that are actually talking to the user and receiving inputs, those end up inside of the view. In our case, web is a little bit different than that. It's not a command line interface. We are basically performing document modifications in response to data that's collected and user inputs. So, the model is the hard programming bit, basically. And then we have the controller. The controller, for us, is going to be a kind of light touch. We're not going to be doing, we're not going to be going to great depths with the controller, but the controller, especially in the context of web design, is doing things like receiving the incoming packet and deciding what should be done, right? The controller activates the regions, activates the parts of the code that need to happen in order for the model, basically the controller is calling the model and it's calling the view and it's collecting all of that out, shipping it out. The controller also controls communication between the model and the view. And this is going to be an important point later on. The thing which makes this whole thing work is the idea of the standardized interface, right? You decide what the data, what the transfer of data, what the structure of that is, and you hold that constant throughout the application so that no matter who you are in the application, you always know how the other half expects it, right? Which is, again, kind of comes back to our idea of the replaceable part. If MVC architecture has been done well, many of these components can be replaced. The one you talk about most is the view, right? So, if you have written the MVC architecture correctly, the view might be a web page. It might be a desktop application, right? It might be, the web page might take one of 100 different forms, right? But modifications to the view will have no impact whatsoever on the model, right? Consider, for example, I don't know if there's a website that's been completely revamped recently, but I don't know. X kind of looks different than Twitter used to, I think. They've made some tweaks. I'm not actually on social media, so I'm not sure if that's actually true or not.
I think that is true,
Yeah.
Well.
So, when they update how it looks, right, they're not doing any modification to how the database operates, right? How the database in Twitter operates, or X, or whatever you want to call it, that has likely not changed for, 10 or 15 years, right? Most of it has been small tweaks to the user interface to try to, make it slightly more human-friendly. Do you guys have a course in user interface design? Yeah. So those types of principles, applied in sequence to attempt to develop a nicer interface over time. That's the work of the person who works on the view, right? The purpose of the person working on the model is making sure that the the database itself is healthy, kept in a healthy state. It still contains the data that it needs to contain, does not contain extraneous data. The speed of the application is also something primarily concerned with here. Like optimization is the concern of the model most of the time, right? Protecting against certain types of cyber attacks is a model concern. The controller should also be checking, right?
City of Hamilton.
Oh, was there a thing with the city of Hamilton recently?
Oh my God.
Okay.
Their whole system is done.
Their whole system is done?
Oh yeah.
Okay, is this like in the spec?
Oh yeah. The whole thing, so you might not have to pay any property taxes because I think they lost all the data.
Hamilton, what
Just put IT hack or something. Cyber attack, yeah. They're totally paralyzed. One of my friends got a fine from the city, something about the ash trees for like $3,000. And they were going into the city to pay, and I said, don't pay because the hackers might have destroyed the database. They'll have no record of that you owe a fine.
Public counselors left in the dark as to the nature of the incident that has hampered communications, transit, and payment processing.
It's been announced, I think as of yesterday, the severity, they're not able to recover from it. So they might have to pay the criminals.
Oh, so it was a ransomware attack?
I would assume so.
They're not gonna let me actually read this, so.
Even if tired and rat.
Let's see here.
Oh, are demanding money. And of course, they're not aware if it's a ransomware attack, but that's probably what it is.
Went down on February 25th. That's quite a while ago.
It's still not recovered.
So Andrea Horvath, not aware if the attack was a ransomware attack. That's probably because she doesn't know what a ransomware attack is. Because she's a politician, why would she need to know that, right? Disabled phone lines.
Because it's all voice over IP.
Is that how they got in?
Probably.
Oh, good Lord, this is quite serious, actually.
Yes.
And I sometimes actually no, I was about to say something that's false. So my wife's in the military, right? She's a pay clerk. And they keep paper backups of everything. And I'm kind of glad they do. If you're listening, the military, good job on paper backups, because the city of Hamilton is learning why you want paper backups. Holy crow. Okay, so do you want to know how a ransomware attack
Don't you love
occurs?
these tidbits I bring into class?
Yes. No, but you know what this is? You know what this actually is? This is like the application section. You know, I think a class is good if we can usefully talk about the news. You know, so ransomware attack. You guys know what a ransomware attack is? Yeah. So as a general thing, what they do is they get in and they encrypt everything. and only they have the encryption key, so only they can decrypt it, right? If they're asking for money, then it's a ransomware attack. This is an incredible level of breach, though, because, like, to bring down the phone lines.
I think it's everything that the city systems were connected to, which also included the phone lines.
Like,
The person responsible will probably get a promotion.
well, I mean, don't people like this kind of get shuffled off to some kind of giant tank somewhere in Manitoba where they make them code all day? It's like you better hack for us or we'll convict you of things. I always think of this kind of thing. This is not the correct way to get the attention of the government. But yeah, so without knowing too many of the details, because obviously you wouldn't want to publish too many of the details, it seems to me they lost root access. Like, I don't think this would be possible unless, like, someone got an elevated level of privilege, right? But, oh, this is the reason you don't use Microsoft. Okay, so the Unix permission system, right? It's built from the ground up to prevent this type of, like, people not being able to access something they don't have permission to. Every file has permissions on it, right? I'm sure you've all done Unix file permissions by this point, right? Like, I was in class one time, and one student showed me that all you need to get, like, any piece of software installed on lab computers is a very short batch script on Windows. It's like 2 lines long. Forget the lines particularly, but basically you can just, like, say, oh yeah, I'm a user, I'm an administrator, you know, in there, and elevate your privilege, and you just lose it, you know. But if they lost the email server too, that means that they, like, somehow they gained, like, the email server will be Linux most probably, unless they were stupid enough to get Microsoft. But yeah, holy crap, interesting. I had no idea this was actually going on. I should tell Ellie to stop. Wait, don't pay the property tax.
Don't pay anything,
I
it's
think-
been erased.
Oh man. I mean,
Including vaccine records.
oh. COVID records, man. COVID vaccine. Oh, I hope they're not going to expect us to re-get the COVID vaccine because they lost the record. That's silly. It's like, all right, the city lost the records. Everybody has to get vaccines from measles, mumps, and rubella again. Hope you kept those little cards for all your children.
Yes.
Good gravy. Wow. Okay, all right. But yeah, yeesh. Good lord. So, anyway, what were we talking about? Model view controller. So, the controller is the thing that receives the incoming HTTP packets. It will then cause the model to do something, right? Either load data from a database, or in the case of a post request, store data in the database, but the model will do something, right? The model then sends any information that's pertinent or resulted from that transaction. It will send that information back to the controller. The controller will then send that whatever piece of that is relevant to the view for the end user to see. Sometimes this might be as easy as a success or failure message. Sometimes this is the content of a database. The view then integrates the information received from the model, creates some kind of view for the end user to see, and then fires that off to the controller where it is put back and sent off in the response packet. So, an important thing to remember about the way PHP works, because this is ultimately all of this is PHP code, right? Even though the view is ultimately going to be expressed in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, those are all being created and sent out by PHP ultimately. So, a very important thing to remember about PHP is that the PHP code itself is not visible to the end user. It stays in the server. Anything that gets sent out gets processed before it gets sent out, so the PHP itself is removed, right? So, basically the view and the controller have the ability to prevent information from being sent to the user. Just because the model is sending out a large portion of the database, if the view says, I only view 10 of these entries at once, the rest of them are not being sent, right? Unless you're doing something like encoding the rest of them into JavaScript and having some kind of dynamic JavaScript that loads them. Obviously, there are ways around all of these things. So, benefits of model view controller architecture. Developers specialize towards front end can modify the view files without impacting business logic. This is another important point, is that if you look at job applications, you will often see the terms front end, back end, full stack, right? The front end developer works with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The back end developer works with PHP, the database, and server configuration to a limited degree. A full stack developer does both of those things, front end and back end. So, these are considered different skill sets. Whatever it is about a human being that makes them good at designing a web page is not that's not the same skill as being able to, securely and robustly protect a server from cyber attacks, like the city of Hamilton recently experienced. Holy cats. Different skill sets, right? One is almost an artistic profession, right? Because, while there are some good design patterns in user design, it ultimately is more of an art than a science, right? Whereas server programming is certainly more science than art, right? It doesn't have to be ugly, but it should be robust. Or, pardon me, it doesn't have to be pretty, but it should work. So, this allows for faster development because it means people can work in parallel rather than having to work sequentially. It also means that views and models can be interchanged. Multiple views can, you can have multiple views for example, mobile versus desktop platforms. Although, this is kind of an older way of thinking about web pages. The whole point of responsive design is to design one web page that looks good on both mobile and desktop. An older way of thinking about it is, you read what type of what the characteristics are of the computer doing the request, and you send them a web page that's appropriate for that requester, right? If you are on a desktop, you send a desktop version of the website. If you are on a mobile, you send a mobile version of the website. If you remember from a few years ago, most websites had like a link that said click for the mobile version if they had one. You notice they don't do that anymore? Right? That's because of responsive design. One view for both of those applications. It's a better way of doing it. But that's an example of, you can kind of think of responsive design as being, I have developed a series of views rather than just one. That's kind of like the idea with responsive design. I want my website to be a collection of very similar websites that modify themselves as I change the screen resolution. Whereas, and that's kind of, that loads it off onto the client, right? But you can also do that from the server's perspective. So, yeah. Furthermore, the locations of bugs can be more quickly identified and they can be fixed. So, if you've mixed everything up together, if you experience a bug, where's the bug? Do you want to have to look through 70,000 lines of code or 700 lines of code? Right? Even the search operation isn't going to help you too much when the size of the files get too big. If you want some anecdotal evidence of that, this is basically the situation I got myself into on my PhD thesis, and it was hellish.
What was your thesis, Dr. Mark?
I wrote a compiler. So I won't get into the specifics, but these are going to sound like specifics, but they're not. What I did, there's a class of languages that don't describe software, they describe hardware. These are called hardware description languages. There's one of these which, on paper, in the marketing copy, claimed that it was written with more rigorous mathematical rigor than other hardware description languages. These languages are kind of like ad hoc languages where they just pile features in over the decades without any regard to semantic consistency or anything like that. The language I'm comparing myself to is VHDL, if you're interested in looking it up. The language that I was operating on was BlueSpec System Verilog. The theory was, because it originated in a more mathematically rigorous formulation, it should be amenable to automatic processing into a logical theorem-proving environment so that you could prove formal mathematical properties of the hardware, which would be a great result if you could get it. Basically, the process of my thesis was a process of discovering exactly to what degree everyone was lying about things being, mathematically rigorous and easy. And I ended up, the goal of the thesis was to implement software that performed that automatic translation. So it was a cross-compiler. It compiled from this hardware description language into the theorem-proving environment, which is a logic language in the same family as Prolog. It worked okay for some examples, but it's not really extensible. You want to see the code? It's on GitHub, publicly. Here we go. This is me. This is my thesis, right here. This is the source code. It's written in a language called Haskell, which is a language in the functional program paradigm. But let me just get, this one's the meat. This one's the meat of the whole thing. So, in theory, this is like a language which is a highly abstract language. Perhaps I wasn't using the abstractions in the language sufficiently well. Perhaps I'm just not a good enough programmer. But I think it kind of partially came down to I didn't have enough IQ. I'd bitten off more than I could chew. But this took me 10 years.
Wow.
And we're only halfway through it. And this is one of 11 apiece. Not all of them are that long, but like this one's just type definitions. Relatively short. But yeah, so working on that thing, I had to rip the guts out of it 4 times over the course of the project, because each time I kind of hit the limits of the conceptual model that I found describing the language, and I could take it no further, and I needed to prove something a little further because my supervisor wanted results. So but yeah, that thing was hell to work with because it wasn't properly modularized. And I thought I'd done, quite a lot to modularize it, and I was using an inherently modularized language, and it was still hell, like PTSD levels, But anyway. So, virtually all PHP frameworks, including Laravel, use Model View Controller as the foundation or have it as an option. However, we can build an MVC app with plain old regular PHP. For us, we are going to be using a switch controller. So you remember switch statements? We're going to use one as a controller. Not too bad, right? So let's look at how we build an MVC app without a framework. We will learn to drive in manual before we learn automatic. So, the value in a design pattern is that we do things in one specific way and only in that way. If you find it frustrating using the design pattern, if you're inventing all kinds of clever little workarounds to not actually use the architecture the way that it was designed to use it, you're basically not being a good citizen of the architecture, right? You are working against all of the modularity that the architecture is attempting to put in place. So, if we start having the view do things that only the model should do, for example, calculations, we've broken the pattern. So, business logic and calculations should go only in the model. The view should only be concerned with how the data produced by the model is viewed. It should not perform any modification to that data whatsoever. If a developer needed to fix that calculation, they would be even more confused than if no pattern was used. If it's if everything's a great big schmozzle and you have no idea where something is, you at least know that, right? You start off with the true fact, the thing I'm looking for could be anywhere here. And then you can, phrase your search appropriately. If something's supposed to be somewhere and it's not, right, you will spend more time looking for it because, you went in with an incorrect assumption. As a result, the descriptions for how to implement MVC in these slides are more than guidelines. They are actually strict requirements. Any deviation from these requirements, even slightly, is breaking the pattern. So, if you are writing an assignment, as you may be doing in the future, about MVC architecture, and it says, this is your pattern, follow it. If you don't follow the pattern, you're losing marks. Make sense? I think that's reasonable. I probably said something, during programming fundamentals, I probably said something like, I'm not choosy about how you arrive at a solution. At this point in time, I'm mainly concerned that you are able to get things working. That was the skill I was trying to teach you at that point, right? We are now beyond that. How you implement things has begun to matter. And, as soon as we dipped our toes into PHP, that was the case. Because, again, PHP is one of those languages where you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. You can know just enough to get yourself into a lot of trouble by leaving yourself vulnerable to cyber attacks. City of Hampton. They're just getting, I'm to the point where I'm just gonna make fun of them now.
Okay, good.
Yeah. They deserve it. I'm sorry, but something like that does not happen without negligence, It was either negligence or an actual spy,
You don't think they're still using Windows 95?
Oh,
At City
man.
Hall?
Knowing them, they're probably using Windows 7 or whatever it was. What was the bad one? Was it Vista? Windows Vista, yeah. Oh, man. My recording is still recording, right? Yeah, okay, good. And besides, just a kind of low-level, bashing of local government is a very strong Hamilton tradition. So, the question you may ask yourself, we've talked a lot about that the model, the view, and the controller are communicating with each other. We have not talked about how the model and the view and the controller are communicating with each other. This is a template array. The template array is implemented as a JSON object. You'll notice Then we have a series of keys and a series of values, right? So the top level here is a dictionary. We have success, display success, display comments, how many comments, and display session variables, right? All of these are, strings or integers which are attached to the JSON object, which are passed between these things. The comments here is an embedded array, right? Now, I'm not saying that every application will have this exact template array, right? The template array is something you design for the specific application that you're working on, right? And likely, it's not going to be designed by you until you're a senior developer, right? This is something that someone important decides, and it's your job to implement, right? Someone with experience who knows what they're doing. So, not only are the comments an array, but the elements of the comments array are themselves associative arrays, right? So this is nested JSON structure. The thing this particular template array is solving is comments on what are the comments that have been made on a message board? You could take this and you could apply it to the bottom of an article to get comments on an article or whatever. Very similar system, right? You can see that this is, the template. I'm not actually sure if this is I'm not sure if this example is old or was made to be funny historically or something. But this is a conversation between Stephen Harper and George W. Bush, right? Which, it's been a number of years. That's old enough now to be nostalgic about the Bush years, right? Or nostalgic about the Harper years. Harper outlasted Bush, but you can see these are being sent in 2006. But the point of this is that this is an agreed upon interface. You are not at liberty to change the structure of the template array. You are only at liberty to modify the values contained within it. Does that make sense?
Is the template array its own entity, or is it contained within the model?
The model will generate it, but it is its own entity. To say that to imply that it's contained within the model would imply that it never leaves the model. If it never left the model, how would it communicate to the view? So it does this. You can think of this as the return value of the model. Does that make sense? This data will, some of it may originate in an SQL database. This stuff is likely to have originated in an SQL database. Some of this other stuff, possibly not, right? Like record 0006 was successfully deleted, might not be, that is a return, that's a message about the success or failure of a database operation, which is not the same thing as the actual data in the database, right? But yeah. You guys you get where I'm going with this? By fixing the template array, making the structure of it rigidly defined, it means that you can write several different views using this template, like all, if, it reduces the problem of writing the view to, how do I display this? Right? And you can do that in several different ways and end up with several different views, right? Does this make sense? Sort of? Maybe? A little bit? Any questions? Okay. So, the template array is the how the controller communicates with the view. The controller is responsible for setting the values of the template array. The template array is an associative array of keys and values. The controller might call model functions to help do this. So, I wasn't giving the controller quite enough credit. The model doesn't do anything on its own. The controller has to call functions of the model, and then it passes the data those functions return into the template array and then sends that off. The view file will only read from the template array. The view file will assume that the values it requires have already been set by the controller. So, I already talked about this example. So, view files are made up of HTML and CSS and some very specific types of PHP instructions. So, important concept number one. So far, when we've been working with PHP, we have been opening a PHP tag at the top of the file, closing it at the bottom of the file, running our PHP in the middle, and that's all we've been concerned about. PHP embeds into HTML the same way that you can embed any other type of tag. So, at this point, I'd like to jump out of this and show you some of the files in our basic MVC example code. Zip file, which is in the same folder in the modules on Canvas. So,
Can we stop right there, Dr. Moore?
yes.
So we have the three files, the model, the view, and the controller.
Mm-hmm.
In the assignment, we have the same thing, the model, the view, and the controller. But then there's also a bonus file called the configure.
Ah,
What is that?
well, let's take a look. This would be...
That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
Starter code, top, center.
Yeah.
There we go. Just by comparison, I wanted to know what the difference is.
It's an excellent question.
And I also noticed that in this working example, there's a secondary file there.
Yeah, there are two views
Yes.
in this example. Yeah. Ooh, Kevin uses a map. So, let's take a look at the config and see what it contains. Config contains configuration information, in this case, the configuration information required to connect to the database. Yes, very important.
Isn't that supposed to be in the controller? Would you not think that that configuration information would be in the controller?
Well,
Because that's what you're using to connect and establish that connection?
but it's the same each time, is the issue. So, like, this will be more obvious once we dig into the structure of the controller, but the controller is mostly concerned with how do things run differently depending on what operation is being requested. If there's certain stuff that's always done at the top, no matter what operation is being performed, that is part of, like, well, the configuration or the model, right? So the purpose of this file, it has all of the database credentials. You remember when we were doing databases last week, I actually did this. I pulled our credentials out and I made them into variables at the top. Now, it actually makes a great deal of sense to do this.
Because it's not changing?
Well, A, it should not be subject to change. B, if this were a real server and not XAMPP, these are your actual SQL credentials, like the credentials that the server uses to modify the contents of the database, right? If those ever got out, you'd be in deep doo-doo, right?
City of Hamilton.
Even, well, actually not quite as bad as that. Somehow the city of Hamilton has managed an even worse exploitation than this. But if they're off in their own file, then they don't have to be opened very often, right? And how do you want to say? Like, it is possible to like protect and encrypt this type of information as well, so that, you know, there's this rule that we have that probably the city of Hamilton never heard, which is you should never store passwords in plain text on your computer, right? It should always be encrypted. So, like, if you wanted to increase security from here, you'd have some kind of routine that loaded the connection information and decrypted it and then used it to connect to the database. So, to address your question more directly though, this is the establishing of the connection, not the use of the connection, right? Establishing the connection is something you have to do all of the time anyways, and it doesn't, like, up to this point, all we have is a connection, right? We haven't chosen which operation we're going to perform on it, we haven't generated any SQL queries or sent them or done anything of that nature, right? All we've done is, can I connect? Okay, I can, here's the variable, right? Which is useful. It's useful to take that and separate that. So that's what config is doing here. PHP, of course, has a number of configuration options more generally, which sort of venture into server configuration territory. You guys want to see that file in XAMPP? Are you interested? I'm showing you to you anyhow. Oh, yeah, I gotta load XAMPP for that, okay. Gonna need it eventually anyway. Makes me really happy that I never like set up a login with the city of Hamilton. Because like, although the ransom, like, so the thing about the ransomware attack, right? It's like, if they encrypted the data, they probably made a backup of it, right? They probably have all of the data, right? If I was a hacker, that's what I would do. Like, and you know what the worst part is I can't even be too mad at them, because like, we're getting to a point where like, that can happen to anyone, you know?
You should have known.
So clearly something should have been done, but like, don't underestimate the cleverness of hackers either. Like, it's kind of like, security is always a series of deterrents, you know? Like, do we put locks on our front doors because they're completely impenetrable?
They're just there to slow people down from breaking through.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, if you want in, you'll have to risk someone, you know, walking by in the time it takes you to break my lock, right? Security cameras are a deterrent. If a person really doesn't care about a security camera, it's not going to work. And if a person has a crowbar, they'll be able to get in your door, right? This is kind of like the way that security works in a very general sense. The idea that you can completely secure something like software is, we'll see. Maybe they'll do it eventually, you know? But if you take a look in Apache and you take a look at the config menu, PHP, that is php.ini, is the configuration file for PHP. So I'm going through this because I think you probably have you probably aren't quite sure what a configuration file is either, right? So basically what a configuration file is and does is it allows you to set a bunch of variables to be read by another program that affect how that program operates, right? In this file, anything with a semicolon is a comment character. Like semicolon is the comment character. So, for example, there's a section on file uploads, right? So, if you don't want your server to receive file uploads, you can turn it off, right? If you can select which directory things get uploaded to. You can select what the maximum file size for an upload is, right? Max number of files that can be uploaded on a single request. These are all important configuration things that we, most of the time, don't have to worry about, right? We don't have to worry about the configuration unless it's a problem, right? It's kind of the same idea for the config file here that we were looking at. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Cool. So, going back to here we go. So let's take a look at our controller, shall we? So, the first thing that we're doing here is we are including app.model.php. Then, we are creating the template array, getting our inputs, operating on those inputs. We'll get into that a little bit more. This is the switch case that's like the meat of the controller. Then our template array is populated with functions which have been loaded by the model. So, in order to understand, and you can see we have another include statement down here. So, in order to understand the structure of this code, the first thing we need to discuss is the include statement. All right? So, first we have to know what paradigm we're operating in. Include statements operate in PHP roughly the same way that they operate in the C programming language. This is different from how C# thinks about it. So when you import something in C#, right, you're basically looking through a bunch of library objects and saying, I want that one, and I want that one, and I want that one, and you are importing the definitions of those objects so that they can be used by your program, right? Most of the time, a good programming IDE will even import things for you. If it detects that you've used a particular library, it will automatically insert your import statement at the top, right? In Unity, one of the things that we imported was mono behavior, and that allowed us to have our scripts inherit from mono behavior and get access to the start and update methods, just to pull from there. That's a different thing conceptually. With an include statement, literally what you're doing is you are saying, copy and paste the contents of this file here. Does that make sense? When I include app.model.php, and this is actually a pre-process, well, I shouldn't say that. In C, this is a pre-processing step. You guys know the difference between a preprocessor? What a preprocessor is? No? Okay. So, the preprocessor is basically a string manipulation engine that's slapped on the front of most compilers that allow you to manipulate the text before it's compiled, right? So in C, for example, you can use what's called a define statement to set up character substitutions. Your C file doesn't actually have to be syntactically correct in and of itself. It only has to be syntactically correct after the substitutions have been performed, right? So you can have things like, define triple as 3 closing braces. And if you have, somewhere in your code, the word triple, these are usually capital, all caps, the preprocessor goes in and replaces it with 3 closing braces before it attempts to compile the C code, right? So that's pre-processing. The include statement, a la PHP, is a pre-processing step. The thing that the PHP will see, right? The thing that, like the PHP that actually gets fed into the PHP interpreter, will be one PHP file where the contents have been, the contents of the PHP file have been put together, pieced together like Lego using these include statements, right? So physically, this is what happens, right? The interpreter hits include app.model.php, then it looks up that file, app.model.php, copies it, and pastes it. And that's it. That's what an include statement does. So, in consequence of that, there we go. In consequence of that, any statements that are not inside of a function are just executed when the file is loaded, right? And any functions which are defined for later use. So let's now examine the contents of the model itself. Normally, you would have a database connection, you would run an SQL query, you would get the contents of the database. You know, as that process is given in assignment 4, right? Here we're doing something relatively short and quick. We are just returning the data itself rather than connecting to a database, because connecting to the database is an extra step, and we're just trying to demonstrate the architecture, right? This also demonstrates that the model itself can be changed without changing the view, right? If we needed to, we should be able to replace the contents of get all doctors with a genuine, bona fide database connection and database SQL query, right? So long as the SQL query is returning this information, which is expected later on, it doesn't matter where it's stored or how, right? It doesn't matter whether it's hard-coded into PHP itself, as it is here. It doesn't matter whether it's stored locally in the file system of the server. It doesn't matter whether it's stored remotely in an SQL server. Obviously, one of those is the best, but question?
If this is built into the model, and your controller is calling for this,
Mm-hmm.
and it then displays that part of the array, the names and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
What if you then want to delete one of those entries? Is it deleting it from the PHP script, or is it deleting from what's been sent back to the user to view? Do you know what I'm trying to say, Dr. Mark?
Yes.
Will that always be there? If I have a delete function, is it going to delete it from that script, or is it going to delete it from the view?
The way that this is currently configured is that it will delete it from the view. This model
Will remain there.
will remain here, yeah. And besides, because this has been hard-coded into the PHP, this is regenerated every single time the script is run anyways. Right? But again, this was supposed to be a quick way of doing it, right?
Okay, I'm asking just because the assignment, even though we haven't covered it, I was poking around and it just seemed a bit confusing as to what was going on.
Well, we can take a look at the
But
assignment.
that makes a lot of sense now.
Okay. Good. I'm glad when things make sense. Where are we here? It's starter code. Let's see here. So,
For example, right there, there's a delete a record, there's a create a record.
yes.
So even if you were to create a record and it's displayed there, and then you delete it,
Well,
this isn't a repository somewhere like a database.
let's examine the structure a little bit more before we jump to that conclusion, right? But there's, first, I think you probably know this, but I'm gonna lay it out just so that it's explicit. This thing only does one operation at a time, right? It's receiving, whether it's performing a create or a delete from the client, but it will never create and delete at the same time, right? Because it's receiving what it's supposed to do through the act variable, right? The act variable either says delete or it says, you know, this, that, or the other, right? So, this will only be deleting or creating on any given run, right? So, let's look up the definition of delete record. As one of my favorite professors in university would say, use the source, Luke. So, this model contains all the functions that access and modify the database. So, pardon me, remember that in the configuration file, we already set up a con variable, right? The connection variable. So, if we got this far and the whole thing didn't exit, right? Because an exit from the configuration, because the contents of the configuration file are just copied and pasted over, an exit there means exit of everything, not just that, right? If we go to delete record, we use the global con variable, that's just, you know, for scoping. Prepare the statement, delete from behaviors where ID is equal to question mark. You can see that delete record is receiving an ID variable. We then provide ID and execute the statement, and that's it. This one's not even actually waiting for a response on success or failure. So, if we take a look at the controller again, right? We are passing in the identification number, which is received from the, let's actually see where that's received from. ID is here, filter input. Yeah, so these are the two places where we're receiving like these two very, very important parameters via GET request. So ID is the ID that the query will be used on. It's received in the parameter, passed on to delete record here. We then use that function. It removes that, it sends the query to the database and does not wait for the response actually. So I would say that this here, deleted record, 5 or whatever, is perhaps putting the cart before the horse. We're not actually reading whether or not this operation succeeded in this case. We're assuming it succeeded. But the way that you would typically do that is with a making delete record return a Boolean, like true on success, false on failure, and then you would read the state of that to indicate whether or not the operation succeeded. Does that make sense? So, quick quiz. What would cause this operation to fail? Assuming that the connection was established correctly. want to see the SQL again? What could cause that to fail?
If the ID is not as expected.
See, that was my initial thought as well, but I kind of have a feeling, because of the way PHP works, if ID never matches anything, then like this is a delete everything matching this expression. If this expression is unsatisfiable, right, like the ID that you're looking for doesn't exist in the database, I suspect it will just do nothing and return success, right? Because it successfully did what you asked. You asked for nonsense. What would cause an actual failure level error would be something like this table doesn't exist. Right? Because you can't perform any query on a table that doesn't exist, right?
My question too, as well, Dr. Moore, would be how, if you hit the delete button, how is it identifying the record that you want to delete? It's saying with a given ID, you would need a separate input box, would you not? Say you want to delete record number 5.
So I'm going to step into user interface design to answer this question, right? In order to delete an entry, a record, or a post, you will not typically have like a text box at the top that requires you to enter a entry ID number and then a delete button, right? I guarantee you that tweets have unique identification numbers. Do you ever see them? No. So how would you know to enter it, right? Basically, if you're requiring the user to see irrelevant information, write it down on a post-it note, take it to another part of the website, enter it again exactly, and press a button, you're doing your interface wrong, right? If you are requiring the user to use post-it notes, you're probably doing it wrong, right? So, what these things will often do, the identification number will be embedded in the DOM metadata, right, in a way that JavaScript can pull it out, but it won't actually be visible to the user, right? So imagine, if you will, right, in HTML, right, let's imagine that, one of these doctors ends up getting put inside of a div, which is a pretty safe bet in HTML, because a lot of things go inside of divs. Like, I probably demonstrated this before, but this is still a useful thing to see, right? Oh. Wait. Sorry. Just to demonstrate what the level of div usage on a typical website, let's take a look at Canvas, right? Once this thing loads. Hurry up! It's like, don't power cycle me for no reason. I'm the person, you're the machine. Learn your place, machine. And here we go. Right? Div, 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 div. It's all divs, all the way down. In fact, if you open up these divs, there are more divs inside them. Div, 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 div. everything is divs. Right? So, when you are like displaying a database entry, you're typically doing it in one of two ways. You're either making a table or you're making a bunch of divs, right? So let's imagine, just for the sake of argument, you're making a div, right? So you've got a div, right? And you've got like name and location. Nick and here, right? In HTML, you'll have, you know, something like that. You'll generate one of these for each database entry, right? Let's imagine, well, actually, during generation, you can do something clever, like div ID is equal to post number 357, or entry number. I'm not sure if like the number sign is a valid character in an ID for an HTML tag, but you get the point, right? This thing could, in theory, contain the actual ID that the database needs to operate on that entry, right? And like you might be saying like, oh wait, whoa. That sounds like internal database stuff that shouldn't be reported to the users, am I right? And to that I reply, identification numbers are usually okay, you know, like it's kind of like you have to do a certain amount of this kind of stuff to link the client to the server. And like if you were to say a client, a client can never know a number on the server, then things like cookies wouldn't exist and wouldn't be possible. So you store the identification number on the div itself, right? And then you can embed a little delete button on the div itself, which is typically how deletion works, right? This button, when clicked, grabs, like it's either pre-configured for it or it grabs a reference to the div, it reads the ID number, parses out the actual ID number, and then it sends that as part of the post request package. Delete this number, please. Right? So that's how it would actually work. And when you do it that way, the user never has to enter an ID number and never requires post-it notes. Does that make sense? Getting into the weeds a little bit on it though. That's okay though. Like these are very important questions because they're coming up organically, you know. You remember my teaching buddy who came in and observed the class? One of the things that he complimented this class on quite highly was that the level of engagement with the lesson. You know, like you guys actually ask questions.
Have you viewed his class?
I have, yes.
How was that?
It was good.
Was it
I find economics a bit dry.
I was just going to say,
you know?
it was a business class, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was. The particular one I sat in on was supply and demand.
Okay.
So you know, it's kind of stuff I did in first year university anyway. But yeah, it's interesting because like you just get a lot of people like who just don't say a blessed thing during class. And this is like, I think it's very important to try to build rapport with the students so that they feel comfortable asking questions. Like, you're not gonna snap them or, you know, I'm not saying Robert was doing this or anything, but like, if a student it feels like they're gonna get like negative social repercussions from asking a question, then they're not going to learn as effectively, you know? But, anyway, it's roughly 11 o'clock, we should have our break. Any objections? Yeah. So, as a matter of historical record, the test coverage will be from week 1 to week 8. The stuff that's being covered this week will not be on the test, which is next week. Good. So we had talked about how deletion actually works, right? In this in this example, which is the template code from the assignment, this is frankly quite generous. You're being given like the actual code that connects to and operates the database, right? Similarly with the create function, we have a number of these things which are being read in: student name, behavior, severity, and time when. Based on what is and is not provided, we are sending various messages, and then otherwise we are creating a new record assuming all of those parameters were within the allowable scope, right? So this is what back-end form validation looks like, right? We got an if statement. If not string length is equal to, if it's not true that string length of student name is less than or equal to 255 characters, then student name must be below 255 characters. I'm not going to test it to show you that works, but you know. All of the rest of these checks are necessary as well, because I'm sure if we were to dig into the SQL configuration file, we would find that the student name is being stored in a thing on the database of size 255. So let's actually take a look at that, shall we? There we go. Yeah, there you go. Create table behaviors. Student name is a varchar of size 256, not 255, and is required to exist. So, do you guys remember me telling you about null characters? Right? That's where we go from 255 to 266. We need to preserve one spot in the string for the null character. But that's kind of a sidebar. So, after that, we have the create record call, which calls the function in the model, right? And then we add some additional things to the template. So, in the template, we have a number of flag variables indicating whether there is a message of this type or that type. You can see here, right? So, as we are going to see when we take a look at the view, it's useful to design things this way, to let the view know, okay, this type of message was generated, instead of looking at the message itself and seeing that it's blank, for instance. Right? So, once, and update is kind of a similar thing as well. We then have an element in the template called behaviors, which calls get all behaviors. This is kind of similar to the get all doctors method in the other example. There it is. Get all behaviors is simply, in terms of SQL, it's simply select all from behaviors, right? So it's just fetching the entire contents of the database, and we are then saving that to the template here. It's getting saved to the template. Is this making sense so far? Sort of? Is there anything in particular that you're wondering about? No? Okay. Well, if you think of anything, I'm right here. So, at this point, the template array is completely set up. The only thing that remains is to run the view, right? Include app.view.php. Now, again, if you're thinking about include statements the same way that you would think about import statements in C#, I bet you've never seen one at the bottom of a file before, right? So, the position of an include statement matters. When that include statement is encountered, because remember, this is an interpreted language, it gets fed in one line at a time. When the interpreter hits that line, it goes looking for this file, takes the contents, drops that in, and then continues interpreting. The position is important. It's only running the view after everything else has been run. It's doing it last. Does that make sense? Sort of? Hopefully? So, let's take a look at the view itself, and I think it would be useful to have syntax highlighting for this. So let's open up VS Code. So the first thing that you'll notice here, the file extension is PHP, but the document type is HTML. If we scroll, you'll see that we have PHP tags worked into this HTML document in what is a very minimalistic fashion, right? You'll notice that neither the model nor the view, nor indeed the configuration, has at any point output anything directly using an echo statement, right? Remember that an echo statement takes a string and adds it to the outgoing packet's payload, right? It adds it to the outgoing file. This is the outgoing file that we want to send out. But we need to integrate the information which was received from the template. So, note this PHP construct. We have the opening PHP block. We then have for each. We did for each loops before, right? So basically, this is a loop that runs once for every element of the behaviors array. Each time it runs, behavior is the array that you're in, like the array of that iteration. It's kind of a little tricky in this case because it's like an array of associative arrays, right? But you can see we have behavior at ID, student name, behavior severity, and time when. These are all echo statements which again are existing inside of their own little self-contained PHP blocks, right? One per line even. So, to know what the heck is going on with this, we have to explore a little bit about how PHP is run, right? This is kind of the PHP interpreter in application, right? So, this is how PHP thinks of itself, all right? When you write a PHP script, the purpose of the opening PHP tag is to turn on the PHP interpreter. By default, the PHP interpreter is off. We don't, if we were to write just plain HTML, give it the .php extension, it would run, it would be fine, it would load up just the same way that a regular HTML file would, right? Adding the .php extension allows the option of turning on the PHP interpreter. So, the PHP interpreter gets turned on when we encounter the opening tag, and it gets turned off again when we encounter the closing tag. So, in other words, it's a way of saying, start PHP, 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 okay, end PHP. Does that make sense? So, what this little guy does, open PHP, echo behavior ID, end PHP, it takes a variable, which we have set inside of PHP, and echoes it in place into an HTML file. This phrase gets replaced with the string, whatever this converts to as a string. It plops that in instead of the PHP tag, so you end up with a TD element, contents the value of that variable. So this is a way of being able to drop actual PHP variable values into an otherwise HTML design. Is this making sense?
So the information of ID is in app.model.php? Where is the
So-
information?
Good question. It's actually fairly complicated how this goes through. So, first, all right, let's examine where TPL behaviors comes from, right? So, TPL behaviors is set right here. So, we have the TPL, right? We have behaviors, which is assigned the value of the return result of get all behaviors. right? Get all behaviors is of course a function in the model. It's actually the first function in the model. Select all from behaviors, right? We fetch all return statements and return that value. So technically, the data is originating in the database, right? The data is stored in the database. This reads it from the database, returns the result as the return value of that function. That then gets written into the TPL in the controller. I should, you know what, I'm gonna write this down. Step 1, data stored in database. Step 2, database accessed by model. Step 3, data passed to controller by model. Step 4, data added to TPL by controller. Step 5, data read from TPL by view. And those are all of the steps. I know it's a bit more roundabout than doing it directly, but it does actually save time and effort if you follow these conventions. So, okay. Perhaps I have satisfied you that it is possible to read PHP variables into an HTML document. Good. So far, so good. The next one is a bit tricky. All right? Notice the curly brace here. Notice the curly brace there. Why on earth would we have a PHP tag with only a closing curly brace? That is not a complete PHP expression. That's not a program, right? So, when we turn on and off the PHP interpreter, basically, it's not like we're destroying the session when we turn off the interpreter, right? The interpreter, when turned back on again, is still running the same session in the same program that it was when you turned it off, right? So here, we start a loop, PHP, open curly brace. All of this gets repeated for each execution of the loop, including the HTML. Right? So, what the opening and closing curly brace actually mean, remember that they are expressible in terms of go-to statements. Right? So, The opening curly brace does two things. Well, it does one thing particularly. It says, this is the point you go to if you're starting a loop segment, if you're starting an iteration. The closing curly brace says, this is the point you go to if you are finished, if you are not executing another iteration. If that thing is empty, right? It behaves the same way as if the condition was false. The body of the loop is never executed. The body of the loop is never executed because control jumps to the closing brace. So PHP operates the same way. It says, okay, I have a loop here, right? If this is false, I jump to here, and everything between is ignored, even if it's HTML. Is this kind of making sense? So, by doing this, by using this pattern, you can actually, you can do two things actually, primarily. Not only can you repeat sections of HTML, you can also turn them on and off, right? So, should be an example of that down here. Yep, here we go. So we have, let's just take error message as a particular example. PHP, if error message has been set to true, remember we set all of those flags telling us whether messages were true or false, right? If the message is true, end interpreter, then you guys know what strong does? Yeah, it just bolds, yeah. So it just bolds whatever the value of message is, and then it closes off the interpreter. So you'll see that most of these have been included in, like most of these are just informational, but the reason you would do something like you'd have all of these different message types, right, is you can actually have them display differently from each other by modifying the HTML. Class error, I'm pretty sure that that's included, yeah, at the top here. That refers to a CSS style setting the text color of the error message to red, because it's an error and errors should be red, right? So, if you wanted to, you could write classes for all of the rest of these different types of messages, display them in different ways, display different symbols with them, whatever you want to do, right? It gives you that flexibility, even though here that flexibility is largely not being used in order to simplify the example. Does that make sense? But you'll notice, again, right? We have an if statement, opening a brace, and closing a brace with HTML in between. If the HTML does not do anything, or pardon me, what am I saying? If the condition comes out false, the HTML is not printed, right? That's basically the way to interpret anything not inside of a PHP tag in a PHP file is, I am attempting to print this, right? So, good.
So what if I wrote if statements from the beginning to end, just one inside one PHP tag? What happens? I mean, without the question mark tag.
Oh, you mean like,
Without the, yes, like
Yeah, you could do this. This is also correct. But, like, this is equivalent, right?
What is the difference between previous
Well, in order to get to get the same thing, you'd have to write it like this. Opening tag strong class equals, and we're already getting into hot water error. That is equivalent.
Why what is the backslash? What is it there?
That's here.
Backslash.
Oh, here.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. It escapes the quotation mark so that you can include quotes inside of a string. Otherwise, it would consider this to be the end of the string, right? So I would have strong class equals, and that's the string, and then I have like the word error just floating in PHP, which would be the syntax error. So you have to escape your quotes.
So this is exactly saying to the previous sentences?
Yes, this is exactly the same as it was, like, in effect, this does exactly what it was doing before. And you can see, I've taken this stuff here and just concatenated it together. The only difference, of course, is class error, which the other ones didn't have, right? It's the same thing, but I ask you, which is nicer to read?
Honestly?
You think so?
Here.
Well, okay. I will hang my head in defeat and walk out of the classroom now. So with these, it's not too bad because the HTML is relatively simple, right? The longer and more complicated the HTML gets, the more you should write HTML in HTML mode, right? So basically the purpose of doing this is to allow you to write PHP code in such a way that a front-end developer would recognize it as an HTML file, right? Yeah. You have to understand that, for certain classes of web designers, they don't even necessarily do or know JavaScript. They don't necessarily know or do any coding at all in the proper sense. So if you have some poor employee who's very, very good at designing web pages using HTML, but cannot program to save their soul, right? Throwing something like this in there is not digestible, right? This is much more highly digestible, especially if you consider that there's actually a contracted form of this. You can replace PHP echo with the equal sign. That's like a PHP shorthand. So now it looks even more like, oh, I'm just directly using a PHP variable, right? So the purpose is to make this look like an HTML file because there is actually purpose in that, right? But ultimately, all of this could be expressed using strings and echo statements if you really, really, really want to. But I hope you'll agree that while possible to encode all of this stuff, for example, as a string, all of this front material, you could say echo doc type HTML, echo HTML, echo head, echo title, behavior tracking application, etc., etc., etc. It's, it becomes much more cumbersome to include all of those echo statements, right? Does that make sense? Good. Any other questions? Good. So, these guys are what I wanted to work up to. So, views are permitted 3 operations, 3 PHP operations. The rest of it should be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We can view template variables. We can perform conditional operations, and we can iterate template loops. Template variables, as we saw, echo the contents of a variable directly into an HTML file. Template switches are if statements, checking a Boolean value in the template array and deciding whether a segment of the view is displayed or not. And as you can imagine, it's also legal to use else ifs and elses here, right? In case you want like one thing to display in one case, but another to display in the opposite, if that's not true, right? But you can't make the logic too complicated, of course. We don't want to burn the brains of all of those poor little front-end developers with our mad programming skills. So, this is an example of a template switch. PHP, if TPL, disp error, then we create a div, class error, error file contents not found, for example. If this comes out false, none of this happens, right? Template loops. Basically, if you have data that needs to be iterated, something that is in an array, right, then you're probably going to be using a loop. That at least has not changed from fundamentals, right? If you're working with an array, you'll probably need a loop at some point. So, it's typical to use for each loops for this, just because they minimize the number of intermediary variables that you need, right? In theory, you could use a regular for loop, initialize an indexing variable I, carry that through, but that's yet another variable that you don't need, and part of the focus here is readability, right? So, for each loops are preferred in this case. Does that make sense? Good. So, let's jump back now and talk about actions. So, you remember me talking about what the purpose of each of the request modes is, right? Get versus post versus put versus delete. Each of these have a particular semantic use. There are various other ways of doing it, though. If we take a look at our control code, you'll notice that we are performing one of several different actions corresponding to, get, post, delete, etc. but we are actually reading an explicit get parameter in order to do this. Get is here being used primarily for the purposes of transparency. A get parameter can be viewed, right there in the URL. You would probably want to encode this as, like if you're sending an ID along, you're probably doing something else, like a delete operation. So all of these operations can take query parameters, right? They should, in theory, all do different things with them. You can read the request mode into PHP. It's _server request mode. And you can switch on that. But in this case, we are simply switching on the value of a get parameter, which is being sent along with the data packet as well. Called act for action, right here. So we switch on act if it's not null, right? It's got action, it's got to not be null. In the case that the user sent delete, it deletes. The user sent create, it creates. Update and perform update are different things. So, yes. Each of these different parameters will be sent by, different buttons, for example. Actions are set up in the view file using the URL parameter with the key act to set different values, create, delete, etc. Actions are then received by the controller as URL parameters. The view file can have links for various actions. So, for example, if we take our old friend, the link, the HTML link, and we wanted to send, if we wanted to activate a PHP link while sending a particular query parameter, you can encode the query parameter directly in the URL that you are sending. Does this make sense? So, up to now, we've been using forms to do this, right? But sometimes, if a button is just delete or update, you can encode that in a link as well. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for delete because you also need the ID number. The ID number minimally needs to be fed in by JavaScript, right? So I don't necessarily think this is that functional, but at least using the scheme that I described here, right, where we were attaching the ID number to the DOM somehow. The other option, though, is that you simply generate the link as HTML with the appropriate get parameter already encoded, right? So, remember that, so you can imagine this link being included somewhere inside of, let's see here, inside the view, right, here. When we process this, we have a column which allows us to delete and a column which allows us to update each of these parameters, right? The ID for this entry is dropped inside the query, inside the query string in the link, right? It's being dropped in directly where it needs to be used. So we don't have to save it to the DOM. We don't have to manipulate it that way. We can just throw it in directly. as well. That's like fine, but you can kind of do less with it because it's not dynamic, it's just kind of statically coded in. But you know, if all you need is to delete some, you know, set it up with the ID so you can delete it, this will do that. Does that make sense? So,
Dr. Moore,
Yes.
in the slide, there is an ID equal number 4.
yes.
Is the 4 has a special meaning?
No, it's just an example in this case, yeah. Yeah, the point that's being made here is we can set the action using a query parameter. We can also set an ID that we want using a query parameter. And also keep in mind, once the PHP has been processed, this would be what the client sees, right? The client never sees, you know, this was a PHP variable. The client is completely and blissfully unaware what used to be a PHP parameter, what did not, what part of this was originally encoded in HTML. It doesn't know any of that, nor does it need to care, right? Because all of the PHP is processed out of the file before it's sent to the client. So, you can also do this in a form by adding things to the action. So, we're going to open up our file that we've been following through for some time and take a look at how it works. But this is an example of an interface. You may have even seen interfaces like this at points in the past. These are how various operations occur on a table, right? We have a delete button at the end of an entry. That would link to app.control, act is equal to delete, and file is equal to failed.jpg in this case. At the bottom, I think it meant this one actually. Uploading a file, there's a little form at the bottom here which allows us to post files to this interface. We're not going to get into how to send images, that's fairly complicated actually. And sort and sort. We can sort by either of the columns. You can imagine action is sort by and column is equal to, in this case, file name, but if we click this one, you can imagine it would be size instead, right? So hopefully, in your minds, you can see how this value of column would be sent all the way down to an SQL query that would be something like, you know, for image, select star from images, sort by, you know, column.
So what is the default for sending notice? Is where the size.
In this case, it's unsorted.
If I click the sort by size, and then what is the default?
Ascending, I believe, is default in SQL. It would also be useful to send back to the client whether the column has been sorted according to, you know, ascending, descending, and by what column, so that these could be composed more intelligently. Basically, the examples that we're following through here are doing a lot of work to avoid having to use JavaScript to do this, right? JavaScript is a tool, and if it's faster and easier to use JavaScript to do something, you should do that, right? But in this case, because the actions are relatively basic, not that much JavaScript is required, and JavaScript is kind of a pain in the butt to work with anyway, so if we can get rid of it, then we should probably, think about doing that. Good. So, we kind of already talked about this, so I'm just going to see if there's any salient points we didn't hit on. The most basic type of controller we can make is a switch controller. Yes, a switch statement that checks to see what action has been requested and executes the associated code. The controller must also populate the template array. That is the responsibility of the controller. The controller must also include the view file to load the actual page content. So the controller is the thing which calls. If we go back, I ask you, which PHP script are we loading in each of these cases? Yes. app.control.php, app.control.php, app.control.php. So, in each of these cases, the controller is the thing that's actually being called. We are entering with the controller, right? In each case. That means that the controller is responsible for loading everything else, including the view. We already talked about examples reasonably extensively. We will use a switch for our controller when we aren't using a framework like Laravel. The different cases of our switch will each correspond to an action. Below the switch, we can put the code that should run in case nothing, no matter what happens, we should execute this anyway. That goes outside and below the switch case, right? Like, roughly this is the structure, right? Looking at our controller. You've got the front matter, which is everything leading up to the switch case. You've got the switch case itself, which dispatches operations, and then everything after it should execute no matter what the operation that was performed was, right? The front matter operates no matter which, as long as it's outside the switch case, it's operating no matter what the actual requested operation is. So if you have anything that's common to all operations, it doesn't go inside the switch case, right? And this kind of, in terms of computer logic, this is something that you may have seen me do previously. If you say something like, if, C1 x equals 5, y equals 7, else if C2 x equals 5, y equals 10, else x equals 5, y equals 13. Right? Just, simple block of code. This guy, and this guy do not have to be repeated, right? They can all be collected up as x equals 5 at the top and removed from each of these cases, and that is still logically equivalent, right? Makes sense, right? So if you're doing something first that's common to all cases, you put that at the top. This also minimizes the code repetition problem, right? where you don't want, like, if you had a bug here, do you want to fix it in 3 places or in 1 place? Always. The same thing happens on the other side. So if we have something on the last part of each of these cases that's common to all 3, we don't have to put those in the individual switch cases or if statement blocks. We can just collect it all up at the bottom, put it once, and that way it's just there once. Make sense? Basically, that's the logic going on here. So, code common to all cases can be placed above or below the switch statement. For example, perhaps no matter what action is taken, a table of entries from an SQL table must be presented. We can access other URL parameters aside from ACT, like, for example, an ID of something to delete or modify. The model provides a library of functions that the controller may call to conduct business logic or database access or both. E.g., a model may include a PHP function, read all entries, that performs an SQL query and returns all the records in a table. A PHP function delete entry might accept an ID and perform an SQL delete action. But these would both be separate functions inside of our model, right? The model is like, it's the actual functionality, aside from all of the moving of data around, right? Models are included at the top of the controller file. Quick quiz, why does it have to be the top of the controller file?
Because the controller file will meet the model and the functions that are contained within.
Yes, you're like 75% of what I'm happy with. So a function must be defined before it's used in PHP. So if, for example, we included the model file at the bottom, we would be using functions before they were defined, and therefore we wouldn't be using them. We would be getting errors instead. Make sense? For smaller applications, we may not even bother with a separate model file, but instead just include all the business logic and database access in the controller. So it depends on how complicated things are, right? But for any reasonably sized application, the specific details constituting the database access are going to be, they're going to be longer than like 4 lines of code, basically. If it's only like 4 lines of code for each transaction, it's really overkill to make a model file. You can just throw that into the controller. But, if you have anything more complicated going on, it's useful to take that out and abstract it out, right? So, database configuration. We can include our database configuration, that is username, password, etc., and connection in a separate file and include this file at the top of our controller. That way, all of the configuration is done by a thing that calls itself configuration. we'll make it clear what files are responsible for what. By the way, we name them. So this is also very important. It should be obvious from the way things are named, what the model is, what the view is, and what the controller is, right? And configuration if you have such. So, that's it for the slides. So, let's make one, shall we? As far as we can get, anyway. So, if you wouldn't mind starting up VS Code and XAMPP, we will do an in-class example. I'm not sure we'll get right to the end of it in this class, so we'll probably be continuing it in the next class. So hold on to your files, folks. New folder, or open folder. This should go in htdocs if you intend to view it. Can't believe it's March already. So, let's do some basic, let's make an HTML, let's make our view first, because that way we can actually load something with the web page, right? So let's make app.view.php. And maybe we'll give it a different name. Let's call it myview.php. Just because this would be like the third app.view file that we've seen. You know? So, insert HTML boilerplate. We can call it basic CRUD MVC stuff. So, in order to work on this, we need to have some idea what the data that we're operating on actually is. So, at the risk of sounding repetitive, let's just use our medication example from previously, right? But we're not going to put it together in a table. Let's do it with a div, so that things are a bit different from the example, okay? So, remember that our medications had, so let's design a div for the medication to go inside of, right? We want a name with something break. I'm going to use breaks even though you're not supposed to. Medication, there we go. Quantity is there, and what else did we have? Is narcotic was one of them. That'll be fine. we can let's make 2 CSS classes. One for a normal medicine and the other for a narcotic medicine. So we'll differentiate between narcotic and non-narcotic medicines by like modifying the styling of the div. Right? So let's say non-narc is, I don't know, background color is Alice blue, border is 2 pixels solid blue, and border radius is 3 pixels. Gives it nice rounded corners, right? Then let's make another one for narcotic, background color will be, let's see here. How about maroon? Border is 2 pixels solid black, and text or color will be white. Something like that, right? So what we need is a template array. The template array should contain an array of associative arrays, which are our database contents. So TPL should have a medicines attribute, right? So for this, we can set up a for loop, or a for each loop. For each, TPL at medicines as med There we go. We can say class is equal to PHP med. Can I use a ternary in here? Probably. Med at is narcotic. If yes, then we want to say I think I'm just going to use the classic if structure. Actually, I think it'll be less confusing. So in one case, we want the class to be non-narc, right? In the other case, we want the class to be narc. We want to select between these two options conditionally. So, in PHP, if open a new PHP tag for the else. And then close off the tag. Or close off the if statement. There we go. I think I have this thing on there. So we select between one of two different div headings based on whether is narcotic is true or false. Right? For the purposes of assigning different class names. Does this make sense? So, the next thing is that med should have, or I can even use this, med at name and med at stock. Right? As the structure here is that TPL is an associative array, medicines getting an regular array of associative arrays containing name, stock, and is narcotic. Like that, right? So we're basically, oh, sorry. If you need to come up and take a look. Yeah.
So where is the closing tag of the IV, the plus non-narc and?
Right here. They're just no longer the same indentation.
The IV is shared, one closing the IV?
So because this is an if else if, it will never be the case that both of them are generated, right? So because it's if else, always only one of them will be. You won't get a situation where they both are, and you will not get a situation where none of them are, right? So in that case, yeah, this works. Make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. So good. So we have a view. We can view the view if we want to. Local host 1080 slash 2024 -03 -5. There we go. myview.php. You can see that we got basically TPL defined, which is true. That is a correct error message. So the next thing to do is to create the controller, because the controller is responsible for creating the template. So we make my.control.php. There we go. Now, the thing that the controller has to do is load the view, right? We've got open PHP. No. loading the controller gets you nothing, right? Importing, or not import, including, including my.view.php gets you back to where we were before, right? Because all it's done is it's loading the entire contents of the view and doing nothing else. But if we now create the template array, TTL equals blank, save, we have a different error now, undefined index medicines. So basically, just for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to drop in some fake data here so that we can see what the view looks like, right? So, medicines is getting an array, he's going to want to be string, there we go. Then we have another, like this is an array of arrays, right? Let's start with 2 entries. Name gets Tylenol. Stock gets 900 and is narcotic gets false, right? And let's do, this one is morphine, stock is 500, is narcotic is true. Oh, there we go. Right? So obviously we don't have a model yet, and we're not processing any transaction types. So all we're going to do is display this information, right? But, we'll be replacing this with other more complicated operations. So, let's take a look. Ta-da! Right? We've got medication, Tylenol, quantity 900, and you can see that the styling has been applied differentially based on whether or not it's narcotic, and everything is nice and lovely and works. Hooray. Make sense? So, the next thing that we want to do is we want to set up database access. Because we want to draw this information not from our, we don't want to hard code this. We want to draw it from a database, right? So, let's see how much of that we can get working in the next 12 minutes. So, there's really no point in reinventing the wheel on configuration files. So I'm just going to pull in app.config and we'll manage it from there, right? So the database name we use is hospital, right? And other than that, we should be good. But, of course, in order to configure the database for use before we use it, we have to include the configuration file, which configures the database. So, include, a little app.config.php. There we go. Now, we have access to the con connection variable. Right? Good. Now, the next thing we want to do rather than hard coding this information in, we need to have it in the database to be retrieved. Right? So, you go into MySQL admin. You create a new database, hospital, create. Actually, let me see if I don't have an SQL file for this already from a previous class. No, it doesn't seem so. Okay, that's fine. So, create table medicines. Go. We'll need ID. Set that up as auto-incrementing. Because why not? Name, we'll make that a varchar of length 256. Stock will be a double or a float. Double would be fine. And then is narcotic will be a Boolean. There we go. Save, process requested, etc., etc. There we go. Now we need to put in our values that we had previously. So insert into medicines. Taking name, stock, and is narcotic, values, Tylenol, 800, just to show that there's a difference, and false. Execute that. Good. Browse. There she is. Do it again. Use the template this time. Give Nini. Okay. Here we go. Stop. Name is morphine. Stock is 90, and his narcotic is true. Go. There you can see our two entries have been added. That's now in the database. Our goal now is to read that information instead of pulling it from a hard-coded PHP variable, which is terrible. So where do we actually perform database queries? What part? It's M, V, or C, guys. It's the model. That's right. So we are going to need a model PHP script. Include my.model.php. There we go. So rather than having this stuff, and I formatted it nicely, so I'm not going to delete it, but TPO at medicines is equal to we will write a function in the model called getMedicine. So, we now need to actually make the model.php. There we go. And we need to include a definition for get medicines. Get medicines. There we go. This should, is it function? Get medicines? PHP, I've got a syntax. Just pay no attention to the little man behind the curtain. Yeah, it is function, okay. There. So this code needs to use the connection to actually query the database. So, putting the connection variable into our namespace, first of all, why are you still complaining? Yes, I know. Save. Am I importing right? Okay. It's not doing my syntax highlighting for some reason. That's okay. We now wish to use the connection to send a query. So, results is equal to connection query. Then we send our SQL query. Select star from medicines. Right? Then, very simply, return results, fetch all. So, let's see how off we are. Oh! Right. Still gotta be PHP, folks. That's why it wasn't syntax highlighting. There we go. Try again. Ooh. Did that just work? There we go. It did. So, we are now successfully loading our database elements into our web page. If I make a modification here, for example, add a new entry. Let's say penicillin, quantity 1000 is narcotic is false. Go. There we go. Taking a look at our website, if I simply reload the page, we refetch the database query, and penicillin is now in our website. Make sense? Cool. Any questions? All right, let me show you very quickly how to export this database, because we're almost out of time. So in the medicines table, if we click the Export tab, Format SQL, click Go. It'll ask you where you want to save it. I'm going to save it to the same htdocs folder, just because that way it packages up when I make it into a zip file. XAMPP, htdocs, there we go. Medicines SQL file, save, there we go. And on Friday when we meet again, I'll show you how to import that same file. Cool. Any questions? You can kind of see how this is working? Hopefully. Okay, anyway, getting there, good. That's as much as I can ask for, really. All right, thank you very much for your time and attention today, folks, and we will resume on Friday.